Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the second in a series of mini lectures on Richard Wright's Native Son. Today, we're going to talk about the 30s in America. We ended last time with Bigger dangling a dead rat by the tail, using it to scare his sister. He was afraid of the rat. Now, he appropriates its threat, controls it, and directs it against someone weaker. In Book 1, he will act out in the same way with Gus in the pool room, turning his fear into violence as a way of denying it. Wright is explicit about the whole process. Like Pip in a way, Bigger forces himself apart from those around him. He shut their voices out of his mind. He hated his family because he knew that they were suffering and that he was powerless to help them. He knew that the moment he allowed himself to feel to its fullness the shame and the misery of their lives, he would be swept out of himself with fear and despair. So he held toward them an attitude of iron reserve. He lived with them, but behind a wall, a curtain. Here, helpless misery leads to shame and denial. Bigger's own mother tells him, "We wouldn't have to live in this garbage dump if you had any manhood in you." Misery, shame, and the powerless feeling that they create then give rise to fear, the fear of being overwhelmed. This fear leads to isolation, as Bigger shuts his family out and shuts himself down. And toward himself, Wright says, he was even more exacting. He knew that the moment he allowed what his life meant to enter fully into his consciousness, he would either kill himself or someone else. So he denied himself and acted tough. In this way, fear leads to emotional deadness and detachment. But although Bigger denies his fear by acting tough, it never goes away. It builds up inside him, turning to anger and exploding in violence. That is the sequence Wright shows us. From helpless misery, shame, and powerlessness to fear. From fear to detachment and denial. From denial to anger. And from anger to violence. In Mary Dalton's bedroom, it is Bigger's fear that leads directly to her death. Native Son is the first of two works we will study that appeared at almost exactly the same time. The other is the Hollywood comedy, The Philadelphia Story. I'll say more later about the interesting connections between these two works, but I want to start today by talking a little about the historical context they both have in common. The era of the Great Depression. Richard Wright's novel, published in 1940, makes very specific connections with the history of the 30s in America. It links Bigger's story to the history of race riots and lynchings in the Deep South, as well as to the early stages of the Civil Rights Movement, the labor movement that gave rise to unions, and the history of the Communist Party, which was far more active and influential in this country during the 1930s than it would be in later decades. Mary Dalton's boyfriend Jan belongs to the Communist Party, which was supporting both the labor movement and civil rights. Jan refers specifically to the trial of the Scottsboro Boys, 9 black teenagers arrested in Alabama for the rape of 2 white girls, a rape that subsequent events made pretty clear never happened at all. The Scottsboro Boys were jailed, and throughout the decade of the 1930s they were tried and convicted repeatedly, although their convictions were twice set aside on appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The NAACP was slow at first to come to their defense, so the Communist Party stepped in and hired a prominent New York lawyer to handle the case. There are lots of really good internet sites where you can read more about the Scottsboro Boys, and you should. Here's one to get you started. The only reason they weren't lynched is that the governor of Alabama mobilized the National Guard to ensure that they made it to trial. This chapter of American history is glanced at more than once in the novel. There is Jan's reference to the Scottsboro Boys, but there is also the sardonic joke Bigger makes to Jack while they're watching Mary Dalton cavorting on a spring break down in Florida. "I'd like to be there," says Jack, and Bigger replies, "You can, but you'd be hanging from a tree like a bunch of bananas." The year before Native Son appeared, blues singer Billie Holiday released a song called Strange Fruit, based on a poem written in 1937 by a Jewish schoolteacher from New York. This teacher, Abel Meeropol, saw a photograph of the lynching of Thomas Shipp and Abraham Smith, which, he said, haunted him for days and inspired these words: "Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees." Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. The author of this poem, Abel Meeropol, was a union activist and a member of the American Communist Party. He published it under the far more Anglo-sounding name of Lewis Allen, first in the union newsletter of the New York Teacher, and later in the Marxist journal New Masses. He also set the words to music. A nightclub owner in Greenwich Village introduced Billie Holiday to Meeropol, and he showed her the poem. Working with Sonny White, she too set the words to music. Her record label refused to record the song, so she released it instead on a small independent label. Richard Wright finished writing Native Son on June 10th of 1939. A month later, Strange Fruit made it to number 16 on the pop charts. It was denounced by Time magazine as a prime piece of musical propaganda for the NAACP. But it went on, despite the magazine's disapproval, to become one of the great protest songs of the 20th century and was adopted as an anthem by the anti-lynching movement of the 1940s.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root, black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to drop. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
So what does all this have to do with Bigger Thomas? Not much, just everything. The title of Wright's novel links it to the biblical tradition of beloved son narratives, but in a way even more profoundly ironic than Great Expectations. Whose son is Bigger Thomas, after all? He tells Jan that his father was killed in a southern race riot. More strange fruit. And in the opening scene of the novel, his mother says she wishes he hadn't been born. Bigger, sometimes I wonder why I birthed you, she said bitterly. Bigger looked at her and turned away. Maybe you oughtn't have. Maybe you ought to left me where I was. This exchange epitomizes the sense in Wright's novel that for characters like Bigger, there is no hope, no redemption. He didn't ask to be born, but as his sarcastic reply to his mother suggests, she didn't decide to go into labor either. Both actions were involuntary, forced, mechanical. So whose son is Bigger Thomas? The word native comes from the Latin verb meaning to be born. It means growing naturally in the place where you were born, and it is therefore a deeply ironic description of Bigger. I said that in Great Expectations, Pip as a character begins with a sense of rupture that isolates him from the past as well as from his present surroundings. It's worse for Bigger. Orphaned, isolated, and terrified by the world he lives in, he has no expectations and belongs nowhere. Watching the African natives on the movie screen, he sees men and women who were adjusted to their soil and at home in their world, secure from fear and hysteria. Adjusted to their soil. This is a definition of native. The members of this imaginary tribe, Hollywood's image of Africa, are the only true natives in the novel, and Bigger has no connection to them at all. They are the fruit that grows naturally on the tree. He is the strange fruit that has grown from a history of oppression, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. When Richard Wright followed the publication of Native Son with a lecture on the writing of the novel, he continued to play on the meanings of the word native, calling the lecture How Bigger Was Born. In this lecture, he says that he saw Bigger as hovering unwanted between two worlds, between powerful America and his own stunted place in life. And I took upon myself the task of trying to make the reader feel this no man's land. This no man's land is the brutal scene of American racism in the 1930s. Not Southern racism, American racism. Even kind and liberal Mr. Dalton is, after all, the owner of the real estate company that operates Bigger's apartment building. He owns the walls, the floor, and the ground they are built on. Everything but the rat and the gun. Bigger has no place of his own, no square inch of the world to which he is truly native in the sense of belonging. Like the image of a lynched body is the strange fruit dangling horribly out of place on the branch of a tree, the title of this novel tells us that Bigger is the orphaned son of oppression, fathered only by no man in a place called no man's land.